We've made a case for why this worldview is true. And a lot of Christians are like, oh, hey, we need to get out there in the culture. Well, let's contribute. If every Christian contributed something, we'd see a tidal wave. And that's why I think it's important for our story is not really a special story. It's just our story. You have a story too. Let's leverage it for the kingdom.
Well, welcome back to the Reasonable Theology Podcast. My name is Clay, and I am excited to share this episode with you. I had a chance to have J. Warner Wallace back on the show, and this time we're joined by his son, Jimmy. J. Warner Wallace, as you'll remember, is a former cold case homicide detective who came to Christ after investigating the claims of the Gospels as if they were a crime scene. He's now a Christian apologist and an author. Now, Jimmy Wallace, his son, is also a detective and is also a Christian apologist. And the two have teamed up on a new and unique project, a graphic novel called Case Files, Murder and Meaning. In this conversation, we'll talk about their experience in law enforcement, how this background has served them well in the world of Christian apologetics, and how fiction can play a unique role in helping people consider the Christian worldview. We're going to talk about how this graphic novel came together, what goes into a project like this, and what it was like for them to work together as father and son. So you're going to enjoy this conversation, lots of laughs, good discussion, and you can find all the resources that we mentioned in the episode at the show notes at reasonabletheology.org/casefiles. So let's jump into this conversation with J. Warner Wallace and Jimmy Wallace. Welcome to you both. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having us. Yeah.
Wonderful. Now, Jim, we've spoken before about how you became a Christian and in your story of investigating the Gospels and the claims of Scripture like a cold case homicide detective, which you were. But Jimmy, how does your journey of faith and coming to Christ, how does that compare to your dad's? Did you have a similar story, or because your dad had already walked through that himself, is yours very different from that?
Yes, there's a lot of similarities between us, like we have the same name. We're both James. Actually, my grandfather was also James, so 3 James Wallaces. All 3 of us were police officers. I'm still working. And my dad is a Christian apologist, and that's what I ended up getting my degree in and trying to dabble in ministry in apologetics. So there are some similarities, but in terms of how we came to faith, I was like about 8 years old when my dad became a Christian. So I remember his heathen days where our entire Sunday was going to Home Depot like 3 or 4 times before he got the right part to fix the house. And then I watched him in those early ages or those early days of his conversion. And he, has a personality that was like when we first started going to the local church with some friends of ours. And I didn't want to go to the youth ministry or the kids ministry then. I think I was only in like 2nd or 3rd grade. He's like, okay, well then I'll just be the children's leader because then I can be with my kids. They won't be afraid. I'll just take this on, even though I'm a brand new Christian. And so I kind of got to see, kind of go along the journey with him. Obviously, not as in depth. I'm only 8 years old, but I think one of my most foundational memories of my entire life is sitting around. Every week, he'd have friends over from that we had met at church, and him and his friends would argue vigorously about every type of question about theology. And as a kid, I just loved that. I just ate that up. I grew to have this perspective that Christianity was a faith that was all about getting really deep and asking really important and sometimes difficult to answer questions. And there was even like a sense that like debate or making really vigorous arguments was just like foundational to what Christianity was, at least in my mind at that time. So that's kind of how, I grew up in that. I still hold my faith today. And now I just have also followed him into the same career work as well.
And how old were you when you realized that, my dad's got a pretty cool job? Because my dad was a fighter pilot, and I thought everybody's dad was a fighter pilot. I didn't know any better. And it's not till older where you realize, oh, no, that was really cool. I should have paid more attention. Were you where every toy you had was a police car, or did it take a while for you to be like, I'm interested in law enforcement?
Yeah, I always, like when I was a kid, I always thought like that's, if you ask me, what are you going to be when you grow up? I'm going to be a police officer. And my dad had actually made me this little uniform. I think it was made for a Halloween or something. that had like the actual patches from his agency. I worked for the same agency now that he worked for. So my agency now, even when I was like really little, and I'm sure there's lots of certain memories that pointed me towards that, but I remember distinctly being at my great grandparents' house. We'd go to Texas, where all my extended family live every summer, and I remember sitting there with my dad and my grandfather. My grandfather lived out there, and they were telling stories back and forth. And my dad was telling him some story of some grisly homicide that he'd gone to, and it was just horrific. And my grandfather's able to go, kind of, he's able to give a story that is just in line. I remember him telling this story about how he opened a door to a room, and there was this thick layer of like it was like a jelly consistency because the blood had been there, sitting there for so long. And I remember as a kid thinking, I don't know anyone whose family talks like this at the dinner table. I need stories like this. And I think that was a big motivator to me. I want to experience these crazy things that my family had experienced.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate the especially as a man, sometimes I think, I don't have any cool stories. Was again, dad's a fighter pilot. My brother's a firefighter. Like they got cool stories. Like my background's marketing. And you don't come away with a lot of cool stories, and I'm sure you both have a number of them now. So Jim, I mean, as you are raising kids and you're coming to faith, you're growing in your faith, and still within, doing cold case detective work. Was that something in the back of your head? Is I hope they go into the family business here.
Actually, no. I mean, I think I grew up. I'll be honest with you. Really, we were pretty strapped financially. My parents divorced. My dad was a police officer, but he had a second family, and I was part of the first marriage. And we kind of grew up pretty. We struggled financially. My mom and I. There's just two of us, and and I went into law enforcement because it's something so compelling when your father is in this industry. That's why you see so many multi-generational folks in first responder careers, because you think of it as a noble thing. And also I saw the consistency of it, right? Like I saw how this was something that would consistently provide us with income, and it's as long as you paid attention to the career, you gave it your heart, you could do a 30-year career, and at the end of it, you would probably be okay. And I saw that in my dad's life, and so I thought, well, just from the perspective of, well, how am I going to make a living? It became something I wanted to do, but I always thought my kids could do better. Like I had a master's degree in
How wrong were
architecture.
you? Here I am.
No, well, I'm not saying you didn't do well. I'm just saying that I thought, when you were in at UCLA and getting your bachelor's degree in psychology, I just thought you probably will never enter into this civil service career that I had done. And it had been sufficient. Look, I always tell people that financial independence is not the ability to buy anything. It's the ability to buy anything you want. And if I don't want anything, I can be pretty financially independent. I can live on a lot less. And so this is how Jimmy was raised. We didn't have that much, but we had enough. And it actually made the other things that were more important, like your faith, your friends, your family, even more important, because we couldn't build a life around the stuff we had. We didn't have that much stuff back then. So I always thought my kids would probably, and I thought Jimmy for sure, his personality was such that I thought, could he do this job? Like there's a certain amount of innate pessimism that's necessary. Like you have to be a glass half empty person to do the job well. And that's just not who Jimmy is. Like Jimmy's he's always smiling. He's happy. But it turns out as I watched him in the first decade of his career, I realized, oh, you know what? Of the three Jim Wallaces, this guy's most geared for this. He's most suited for this job. He can do it and probably still hold his character, still hold his optimism. Because I saw my dad in many ways abandon that early on as a kid. So I was actually pleasantly surprised that he could do it and not become the kind of person a lot of us become. That we're actually talking about in this graphic novel. We've got a character in here, the main character named Michael Murphy. They call him Murph. This guy is a guy we've seen. This guy, and you'll. And I used to think that these kinds of cops were rare. They're just old, crusty guys who are burned out and tired of people. But to be honest, it's not that. It's that every cop at some point is going to become that cop, and I just didn't want to see that happen to Jimmy.
Yeah.
Before we get too far, though, we might have police stories and your dad might have fighter pilot stories, but when you sit around the table, you get to tell stories about how you like talk to Christian apologetics, spread the good news about Jesus. So I think you're still winning. I'm pretty sure when you
Yeah.
compare the stories, yours are the ones that come out on top. I'll just
Yeah,
throw that
ours are
out there.
pretty ours are pretty if you think about it. They're
Yeah,
not
you're right.
they might make for good, colorful conversations, but in the end, they aren't probably going to, edify or lift your spirits, let's put it that way.
Yeah, they're probably more awkward for the table over to overhear you
Yeah.
talking about while you're at Wendy's or something. So
Exactly, exactly.
now I don't recall the year you retired. Was there any overlap of your law enforcement careers then? Did you work together in any capacity?
Yeah, so we had about a 2-year, I think, right, Jimmy? About 2-year overlap. I know on my last shift, I spent working patrol. I asked my sergeant to work a shift in patrol with Jimmy. So we partnered up in a car and we did handle calls, and that was my
Wonderful.
last,
And I think
shift on the
I'd
job.
only worked like patrol like about a year at that point. So maybe I had been hired like a year and a half prior or something like that. But yeah, it was just a
Yeah.
little bit, just enough.
Yep.
Oh, that's wonderful. So you obviously you have this this background, both of you, in law enforcement and also Christian apologetics. And again, we've been able to talk about your story there, and we've talked about cold case Christianity and a lot of the great books. Why is it that maybe the mind of someone that's into detective work is well suited to someone in the world of apologetics?
Hmm. Well, I think that, if you look at a lot of the books that have been classically released over the years, they've always leveraged kind of, a case making, view of, is this true evidentially, the case for Christ, evidence that demands a verdict. I mean, these are all books that leverage at least titles. And for those of us who are in the profession, you get to spend a lot of time in court whether you like it or not. You make an arrest. If it goes to trial, you're going to get sucked into this criminal trial. And you spend a lot of time listening to attorneys advocate for one side or make a case against the other side. And you're doing this. And I think it just develops a certain way of thinking about things. Now, I didn't become a Christian and then become a cop. And I learned this skill set. I didn't know any other way to examine any claim. So if you would have said to me, just as, oh, this is a great restaurant, well, I probably was going to ask, investigative questions before I was going to go visit it, because that's just who I was. If you, so Jimmy was right. Before I became a Christian, my God was like, my marriage and my house. So the home I was making for my kids. So every day I was off, I was just building, building, building. We had a complete wood shop in the garage. you know, Anything that needed to be fixed, I couldn't afford to hire somebody. So I would just figure out how to fix it, how to build it, how to create it. And that was God for me. So I think in the end, um, when I examine, if you asked me back then, well, how do you fix this? It was an investigative approach. It's like, I'm going to ask a bunch of witnesses. I'm going to collect some resources. Everything I did was like, how do I build? What should I put this on the house? Should I fix this and that? Well, what's the case for and the case against? This is like just how you're wired in this sense. And so if you're looking at a Christian case making perspective, because that's what apologetics really is to me, that's a word, apologia, either means to defend. I think that can make it sound kind of a defensive. I'm not defensive about my Christian faith. I want to affirmatively make a case for my Christian faith. And that's really what we're trying to do here. And of course, if that's what you're doing, if you see that as an essential role of every Christian, well, then it would probably make sense that a case making career would help you with that. If we all embrace that call to be able to give a reason for the hope we have, well, that really, if that apology of that word, it can be, it's either to make a defense for or a case for. It depends on how you're looking at this. So yes, I want to be ready to answer questions, but also it's going to involve mostly me making an affirmative case for something I believe, in addition to showing maybe why the alternative is insufficient.
Yeah. So you've got a law enforcement background, your father and son team into Christian apologetics, and now all three of these things merge into this new project that you have. You have this graphic novel, Case Files, Murder and Meaning. How in the world I don't know, is it derogatory to call this a comic book? Would somebody that's into graphic novels be offended if I call it that?
That's what I call
How
it.
did how did this come about? Where did this come from? Obviously, you've published a number of traditional, published books. Is this your doing? Did you have an interest in this that you brought in? How did this come to be?
Yes, yeah. This was kind of like an unrealized dream I think that I had. I think it's something I always would have liked to be involved in making comics, but not something I really thought was a realistic goal. So it wasn't something I was actively pursuing per se. But we had my dream, I think, was always to do something with my dad, something in apologetics, and find some sort of way we could collaborate. And I think we were actually already talking about figuring out what are we going to do together. I was going through a master's program at the time. Hey, after I graduate, what are we going to do? And we happened to hear that David C. Cook, which is a nonprofit book publisher who's published several of my dad's prior books, had bought a small independent comics company, and that they were looking into creating new content, all their own graphic novels. They had seen a lot of success with the Action Bible, which a lot of people are familiar with. You
Sure.
see, like at the airports and stuff. So they're like, "Hey, what else can we do in this comic book graphic novel space?" And so, since we'd heard that they just made this purchase and they were kind of still getting their feet wet, we figured we'll reach out to them, see if we can pitch them some ideas. And luckily, it worked out, I guess, for us, because here we've got the book.
Who is this for? Some people hear comic book and they think, hey, I'm going to get one. I'm going to toss it to my kids. It's going to be great. But you've got a comic book. Murder is right in the title. You've already alluded to, you got this main character who's really probably struggling with his identity and losing himself in this work. Who do you see as the target reader for this? Is it young believers? Do you hope skeptics are picking this up? Is this a wider audience? What is your hope for this format of a book?
Well, okay, so that's a good point because I see it as a novel first. It's a story. Now it happens to be a visual story, but that's pretty much everything I do on the stage with any of my books is I try to make them
Right.
visual for an audience. So this is kind of what this is, a story that's made visual. In some ways, it's almost like a storyboarded movie, right? Where you have all the scenes storyboarded, how the interaction of the characters. And we partner with some really good artists who have done this for other venues, for other characters, even for the Chosen TV series. So we knew we had good artists, and we thought we could do it to tell a compelling story. Now, we did not want to tell an overtly ambitious Christian story necessarily. We wanted to unpack a Christian theme, an attribute of Christian worldview that we could explore, tangential to just trying to tell a good story. And because we're cops and we're homicides, we thought, okay, well, the story's going to be about a serial killer and a team of detectives who are hunting the serial killer. But what can we teach from a Christian worldview? Well, we think that this kind of book then opens up a pretty broad audience. Number one, people who have read it, who have kids, will say to us, and they've sold us so far, no, I think my junior hires would absolutely resonate with this, and I don't think they would be blown, too grossed out. It's just going to depend on the kid. I do think that if a lot of junior hires have already seen pretty much legacy TV network criminal dramas, and if you've seen, these investigative unit kind of crime series on TV, you're going to see a lot worse in those than you're going to see in our comic. So, in our graphic novel. So, I don't think that that's going to be the issue. But you have to judge for yourself how old your kids are and if this would be appropriate for them. But certainly by high school, I think for sure, they're already watching far worse than this on their digital devices before they get to this graphic novel. But what we were trying to do is to create a book that would be, number one, encouraging for Christians, because we want to show that the Christian worldview, it makes sense even in the grittiest, ugliest parts of human culture. If this is true, it has to make sense of those non-Pollyannish, non-Christian environments also. And that's what we wanted to show here. So I think it will encourage a Christian. But I think for non-Christians, clearly people have already started to give this to non-Christians. They've already written back to me and said how helpful it was. And it's only been out a week. So you see this right away that people are thinking of it as, well, this is not so overtly Christian that my non-Christian brother would reject it from me. Whereas he might reject one of my Christian apologetics books because he thinks, oh, you're just trying to convince me of Christianity. This book, you might read half of it before you even realize it's a Christian novel. So that's because the main characters are not Christians, and their struggle is only at the very end going to even be discussed from a Christian worldview. And we're trying to do it in a way that's not too aggressive. Now, I noticed, for example, on our Amazon reviews, and we got a bunch already, that one person complained that it wasn't Christian enough. Now, interestingly, that person read the digital version, and on the back of the printed version, there's a QR code
Hmm.
that brings you to the case for the resurrection. So we see this as a gateway book.
Yeah.
Yes, it's not Christian enough, but it's provocative. I think that most people who will read it will say, oh, that made me think about something. I don't know if that's true or not. Let me see. Let me take another step. And we've given you a way to take another step on the back cover. And the reason why we did that is we thought that, hey, I am sensitive that the atheist that I was would not have read your Christian apologetics book. There's just no
Right.
way. As a matter of fact, when I first investigated the case for Christianity, I didn't even know there was such a thing as Christian apologetics. I remember going through the entire investigation and everything I talk about in cold case Christianity. And at the end of that, I think Jimmy was with me. We were sitting in church, and who comes to speak but a guy named Lee Strobel, who had just written this book called The Case for Christ.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, oh, like there's other people who are wired like me.
Yeah.
And that was encouraging to me. So I think this is the kind of book you can definitely give a non-believer. But the age group is where we were trying to figure out, like, what age group are we targeting? Because this is a graphic
Sure.
novel. It's not a comic book, although it looks like one when you open it. It really is about themes that are serious themes, realistic themes, themes that we have to deal with in our. By the way, if we were like if we were people who make bread for a living, we'd be writing a story probably that at some point is going to involve a person who bakes bread.
Yeah.
So, but that's not who we are. So we're writing a story that's going to be the grittiness of a murder investigation. So that's something you have to think about before you give it to somebody.
Yeah. And, things that are really popular. We talked before about the popularity of true crime stuff. Obviously, graphic novels, very, very popular. And this just has a different purpose. It has a different job than your other books. Like you said, it's has a different intention as to why it was written. And so it's going to be unique in that arena. So, Jimmy, did you get a chance? Are you sitting there over the shoulder of the people that are drawing this and saying, no, come from this angle, or more shadow? Like, were you involved in the creative element, having that interest growing up?
So no, pardon me. No, we were very fortunate. And before we get too far, we should probably shout out our artists. We were paired with Steve Crespo and Dario Formasani. These guys are veterans of the comic book industry. They know better than us how to create a comic book. And so what we did with this process, actually, when we first pitched the idea, there was no artist attached yet. So what we did was we wrote a script, and we did write a panel by panel script, like, page one, panel one, this was going to happen. But then ultimately we let the artists take that and draw it the way that they thought was going to be best. And we're very fortunate to have the artists we had, because I don't know, if maybe for people who aren't familiar with comics, maybe don't understand kind of the breakdown of the writing and art process. But the story, sometimes we've been describing it to people as the story is the script that we wrote is like a screenplay in a movie, but the artists are like everyone else who's involved in a movie, because the artist draws the character. They don't just do the character design or the design of the clothes they're wearing, but they make them emote and move and their posture, and they direct the scene. Where are these characters going to be standing in relation to one another? What's the scene going to look like? The entire set design,
Yeah.
even aspects of lighting are determined by the first artist who ever touches the page. So if you read the book and you enjoy it, you're probably have more to thank for the artists than we do. But we did want to try to put our whole heart into the script and
Yeah.
do something that we thought was meaningful to us and hopefully will be engaging to the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing about this too, is that's such when Jimmy first described it that way for me, I did realize, yeah, have a very small role. But what's interesting is when together we kind of formed this overarching plot, and we went back and forth on some of the details, of course, but in the end it was Jimmy who had the task of putting this in the comic book script form, which I had never even seen before. And I think maybe you got that, Jimmy, from one of the first art directors we worked with on this project. Well, hey, if you're going to write this, can you put it in this form? And so Jimmy had to figure out, like, on a certain page, we're on page 5, I want 5 panels. In those 5 panels, panel 1 is going to be this, and he's describing what's
Sure.
in the panel. And if you read the script, it's like, oh my goodness, there's so much like detail in terms of, like, the panel is going to be this, the box is going to say this, the word bubble is going to say this, the action is going to be this, the setting is going to be this. Here are the characters I want in the panel. I'm like, I'm already exhausted. So as I was reading it, I was like, just having a hard, like, I think of things in paragraph form, right? Like a narrative, like a prose. That's not the way these scripts read. They read like screenplays. And so as he did, now what was great though is the artist might say to us, I think we could do that better in 3 panels. And we
Yeah.
gave them the liberty. Of course, listen, we trust you. Now we got the art back, and we could make some final decisions about, is that character, we did go back and forth. Jimmy created 6 characters to begin with. And then we talked about the overarching narrative. Well, those 6 characters did change a little bit because they started off being maybe one size or one dimension or one kind of angle. And as we developed the characters, they would change. And that was largely because we'd see the artist version and we go, don't like it. Like, it's not your fault. We haven't imagined this well enough. Let's rethink it. And so
Yeah.
that kind of back and forth did occur
Yeah.
for sure.
So ultimately, kind of let them work, and they didn't tell you how to solve murders, and you didn't tell them how to draw pictures.
Yeah, pretty much. As a matter of fact, that was something that was part of the process, is that we several times would have to show them, like, how does somebody hold a gun? Because now you're going to
Sure.
draw this. And if you look at the front cover of the book, for example, you'll see that Murph is holding the gun the way you would hold a gun if you were at the ready. You're not going to have your finger in the trigger guard. You're going to be pointing at, it's just, we had those little kinds of details. Also, like, what kinds of uniforms would be appropriate?
Sure.
What does a sergeant's uniform look like? What does a captain's uniform look like? I mean, there were some questions they just had realistic, they don't know. And so
Yeah.
we'd have to kind of tell them. But for the most part, they stuck to our script. But they did kind of change the way we would reveal it through the panels. And we were so pleased with that. I mean, we have no complaints about any of it. And I've illustrated all my own books. You know that, Clay. I've done all these books where I include hundreds of illustrations in each book. But this is different, okay? This is this takes a skill level that you have to develop. So the same way, it's hard enough to move from nonfiction to fiction on your first try. Do you also want to move toward comic book artistry? I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think you have to let somebody who's really good at it take the lead.
Right. And now, I mean, basically almost served as like technical consultants in a way, like they have on film, like Dale Dye, Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers. So what they came out with might be a lot more accurate than some other, detective graphic novels might have been, because you can go in and say, he wouldn't hold the gun that way.
Yeah, exactly. And I kind of felt like when we did this, there were some questions like that. There were some things that we caught early and had to quickly correct, because if you don't correct it in the first 5 panels, it'll show up for another 100 panels. So you have to kind of
Right.
get it early and get to it fast. So that is one of the things they kind of trusted us to do. Also, we because we weren't just going to talk about a cop drama, because I get called all the time by studios and by agents who want me to consult on one of these shows. I'm just, to be honest, it's not gospel centered enough for me to get interested. If it's a show that's gospel centered, I'm interested, but I'm not really interested in just doing cop stories. Well, the same is true with this book. If we couldn't make a case, and this is a case for the value, how do you ground human value? That's an important issue right now in a culture that is struggling to understand how we identify ourselves. Like, who are we? Who gets to decide who we are? Why is it especially I'm seeing politically right now, we are so divided, and it's going to eventually end up becoming a clash of the classes, because we're looking for ways to unite to some party, some piece of the culture, and divide from the other. This is a time, I think, when we have to ask ourselves, who are we really? And where does value come from?
Yeah.
Does my value come from my political inclinations? Does my value come from my political party? Does it come from where my level of engagement is in politics? Is that how we're defining value? Is it from what I achieve? Is it from how much I make? Is it from my ethnicity? Is it from my gender? Wait, where am I getting value from? Like, why do I matter? Well, that's something we think is time for us to really think about. And I've written about this in Truth and True Crime, but this is very different. I remember, and Jimmy will tell you more about this, when Jimmy first talked to me about how so much of his early moral formation was not from Scripture, I realized that we're going to have to supplement what we teach in Scripture with other kinds of works that actually sometimes are more engaging and are more determinative of what kind of moral value you'll embrace. You think, well, this is why, for example, Jesus uses so many stories to make theological points. He could just make the theological point. He could just be an entire, orator of systematic theology. Instead, he's telling narratives that kind of put the listener in the narrative along for the ride. The story of the Samaritan is such a great, helping the person who needs help on the side of the road. I mean, you end up just imagining yourself as part of that process. So I think this is where a lot of moral formation occurs. It's in narratives.
Yeah.
It's in fiction.
Yeah,
So
fiction can be great for that.
yeah.
Yeah, I had a really
So
great conversation recently with Andy Naselli. He wrote a book about how to read a book is the name of the book. And in that, he just talks about in their home and the value they see in fiction. They get to a point where, hey, you're kind of acting like a Eustace, referencing, the Chronicles of Narnia character that really nobody wants to be Eustace. And just that does help you see through the lens and just have something play out before either visually in a visual medium, but or in a book in your mind, and you do see these things played out and acted out, and obviously preferably there's this gospel theme that's running through, but you see things that you might not otherwise see when it is purely just taught. You can have these examples and these illustrations that come through. And so with this graphic novel, Jamie, what do you hope that someone starts to think about, wrestle with? What are some of the themes that you want them to have stay with them when they're done reading? Yeah, I want them to close it and say, "Oh, that was enjoyable. I liked the story. It was entertaining." What is it you want them wrestling with after?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to this question of meaning. I think that one thing I noticed even early in my law enforcement career was that all cops just assumed that life had value, it had real meaning, and that this was the most important thing to us. We were going to do anything we could to preserve someone's life. Even if there was a law that said like we couldn't go into someone's house because they have some right to privacy, if we thought they were dying inside, of course, every cop knew we can ignore that privacy law, kick down the door, and go save someone's life because human life had so much value. But
Mm,
I didn't really see a lot of people around me because there wasn't very many Christians around me who could really tell you why. Why was human life valuable? We knew it was of the utmost value in our society, and that it was our duty before everything else to preserve human life. But nobody could really explain why. We just assumed this.
wow.
So, and then on the flip, so that was always kind of in the back of my mind throughout my law enforcement career. And then on the flip side, I kind of noticed all throughout my career, I saw the people from my generation were all newbies. Everybody's so focused on their career. They're taking such identity in this. They're cops. That's who they are, and they all judge each other. I may have been tempted to get sucked into this kind of way of thinking too. You start judging each other about what assignment did you work. If when you're all just on basic patrol, you're wondering like, but what area did you work? What did you do? How many arrests did you make? Or what experiences did you have? Everybody's taking so much of their own personal value in what they do. But there's this assumption that what we do is actually valuable and that you can take true identity from it. But this is also kind of an assumption without a lot of grounding, because the idea that we would take identity in what we do is very dangerous, because in the end we retire. And I think I was lucky because I had a grandfather who'd already retired, and very quickly, like we were talking earlier, within about a year and a half into my career, I watched my dad retire. So I kind of always knew, although maybe I didn't want to think about it all the time, the end is coming. It's like this specter that is at the end of my career, that no matter how much I get engaged in this law enforcement thing and think of myself as I'm a cop, it can only last for so long. And so if I really have actual meaning, if my life has true value, it cannot be placed in what I do or what my coworkers think about me. If I really impress everyone and they think I'm just the greatest of the great, at the end I'm going to retire, and pretty quickly people I work with don't even know I had a grandfather that worked at the same agency as me. So he can have a great career, but it does not matter where you retire. At some point, nobody's going to remember you were ever there. And so
Yeah.
that I think that this was always kind of like a thought that I would wrestle with, about where does meaning come from, and it has such great apologetic application, because we know as Christians our life does have value. We do have actual purpose and meaning, but it's because of the value God places on us. We can point to something that is bigger than culture, bigger than the opinions of others, bigger than our own opinions of ourselves, something that is eternal and that will not change, to ground our value.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, really interesting what you've been talking about. Because even in a role that is extremely meaningful, it's very important. We're talking literal life and death. We're talking issues of justice and injustice. Even in meaningful work, there is a higher meaning and a greater meaning that you can't lose sight of. And so it is interesting now that you say that at in a role like law enforcement, EMT, something like that, where they're really uh, dealing with black and white, stark, difficult realities, to understand why is life important and valuable and worth protecting. So you have
Oh,
an
yeah.
angle there that is probably really unique in being able to tell this story.
Well, and what's interesting about that too is that you're right. We tried to create characters that would the cops that would struggle with this as well, and create a suspect who would struggle with this as well,
Mm.
and create a crime series that would illustrate this as well. So you'll see lots of little subtle cues in the narrative that really tease out, what is value, what is valuable, why do we think this is valuable to us. And then you'll see some direct confrontation of the issue at some point as a character is starting to wrestle with this, especially when this suspect is making this team think about this deeply, because what he's doing is he's targeting each murder somebody who is more and more culturally valuable to the culture. And we're in Los Angeles County, where you got a lot of celebrities. If a celebrity gets murdered, it's national news. If anybody else gets murdered in this county, nobody cares. Why is there a difference? Why do we consider some people are more valuable than others? So we want to kind of discuss that issue also, and we want to make a kind of a realistic crime story. I can tell you that what's been so cool about this process, and for me it was shocking, is that I write books. This is not a book. Yes, it's a book, but books are about ideas expressed through words. And so when I talk to you about one of my books, I'm going to talk to you about the ideas that the book contains. Yes, this book contains ideas, but it's a work of art. And when you get it, you go, oh. And I've noticed this about comic book people, is that when they read a comic book, they read it they don't just like, when I read a book, okay, this is Lee Strobel's new book. Okay, I'm going to give Lee a shout out, right? So Seeing the Supernatural, I just realized I had a chapter in this book with Lee. I didn't even know. But when I read the book, I open it, and I get it open, and
Well, that's
I,
painful to watch.
and then,
I
yeah,
treat my
right.
books like
Okay, well, you knucklehead. The point is, but like for me, like a lot of people, I'll dog ear a corner of it to hold my place, or I'll take and write notes in it. This is really good, and I'll dog ear that and put it on my shelf. So later on, I go, yeah, where was that part? There it is. Yeah, this is a really good point. Look, nobody does that with comic books. Even if you're somebody who says I treat books differently, nobody treats their comic books like they treat them like pieces of art, like collectibles. They'll put them in. Have you ever done this with your regular books? Do you put your regular books in plastic with a cardboard backing and stick them in boxes like behind Jimmy's head there? You see all those boxes? That's his comic book collection, all systematized, alphabetized in plastic with cardboard backing. Who does that? Well, comic book people do that because they see, I know, you should be ashamed of yourself. So the point though is that this is, I didn't realize that we created a collectible, and give credit to Crux Studios, which is the imprint from David C. Cook. What they want to do is to reach the world through systematic theology and apologetics, because they do a lot of that. But they also want to reach the world through fiction and art, and they do a lot of that. And this new imprint, Crux Studios, is really an effort, I think, on their part to say, hey, we have to do two things. We have to show the world that this is true, but we also want to show the world that this is beautiful, that it is explanatory, that it is necessary, that it's essential to living a certain kind of life. And that's the two-pronged project of the apologist, I think, is to be able to show that it is true and good. Now, you can do this all in one book, but we thought at this point now, I've already written 9 books that make the case. Now the question is, can we show that it's beautiful? Can we show that it can engage you?
Yeah.
Jimmy reads a lot of comic books, obviously. And I think most of them, he would tell you that even the crime ones, and I think that's one of your favorite genres. Am I right, Jimmy?
Yes, especially right now. Yeah.
Yeah, because we're writing this kind of stuff. But by the way, you cannot become a good writer unless I would never try to do this kind of fictional work or a graphic novel on my own, because I'm not an avid enough reader of this genre to become a good writer of the genre.
Yeah.
And I think you need to do one to do the other. But Jimmy is just saturated in it. But I think most of the time he's probably going to have to turn a blind eye to certain things in the genre because they're offensive from a Christian worldview. And we're just trying to create something that will still be competitive. It'll still take you on a journey, the same kind of journey you can do in other works, but you're not going to have to, compromise your principles in order to read it.
Yeah. And it is just a different medium. Like you said, it gets treated different. And this is a good time to remind people that the opinions of the guest is not necessarily the opinion of host. I would never break the spine of a book. I would never dog ear a page. I don't think the people at home should do it either.
Yeah.
But
I had no idea, Clay, that you were I should have called you first and said, hey, by the way, before we start this
That's
interview,
right.
are you crazy?
I,
Because I need to know if you're crazy. Because if you're crazy, I won't bring this up.
I get a straight edge to underline things or highlight things in
No,
my
you
book.
don't. No,
I
you don't.
do. I
Are you
do.
serious?
I'm with
I
you.
got to meet Greg Kokel,
Yeah.
and he was at a Ligonier conference, and I brought my copy of Tactics, and I said, "This is one of my favorite books. I've read it 3 times," and I hand it to him, and I can tell his immediate thought was liar because it looked brand new. It didn't look like I had ever read it. He
Yeah,
flipped
that's
through this
funny.
thing expecting it's going to look like it fell out of a truck, but no, I kind of just peek in there, turn the pages carefully. Yeah, I've got a compulsion. So I might start getting some sleeves. I'll box them up behind me, keep them
Yeah,
nice.
you know what? Until you go, okay, so at least I can stand on that principle. Until you get plastic sleeves and put cardboard backing in your books, you're still a pretender. Okay, I'm telling you, comic book people are more geeked out than you are. Okay,
That's right.
so
I also
I
will
will
just take a moment to say I disassociate from anything my father said. If I said it on the podcast, I agree. If he said it, I don't know. I don't know if I agree with it or
yeah,
not.
it's not necessarily the same opinion. So
But you know what's interesting about that, Clay, is that this is the kind of thing I hope does like so. Jimmy and I have always been the kind of father and son who would be geeked out on these issues, and we would seldom agree, but we'd always agree. Isn't that weird? How do you seldom agree yet always agree?
Because you always acquiesce and realize I was right all along.
Yeah, that's it. But a lot of it was just that you find yourself disagreeing about some non-essentials and being okay with it. And that became for us like the target of almost all of our conversations, these fights about, these non-essential issues that are really interesting theologically. And we would debate, of course, to every person who holds to a certain non-essential, to them, it's an essential. So here we are, having these debates, but that's the kind of thing that I think was helpful for us to create this book because it is that neither one of us is going to roll over for the other, and we're going to have to make a case for why we're doing it this way, why we're doing it that way, and only once we've kind of hashed all those things out did we put it to paper. So that's why I think this was probably and that's also I
yeah,
think a good attitude to have, a discernment attitude to have as an apologist, right? I mean, I'm gonna if I hear something that I think is intriguing, I'm gonna deep dive it with 1,000 other resources to see if any of that's true, rather than just accept it on its face. And that's just always been so. Jimmy and I've had that kind of relationship where, okay, you make this claim, and I'm like, well, let me think about that for a while. Like, I'm not just going to give it to you. I'm not just going to say, okay, you're right. Neither one of us is ever willing to just say, okay, you're right. Instead, we're like, well, yeah, yeah. Then we'll go back, and maybe we'll at some point in the future bend our knee to somebody, but at least at first, we're going to be like, no, you're an idiot. You're wrong. Don't even, yeah, yeah. But this is, I think, which maybe that's just different about men too, is that cops do this constantly. And we tried to capture this in the graphic novel, this banter back and forth between officers at a death scene or at a murder scene. It almost that's like disrespectful, but teasing that we would do with each other constantly. It's an awkward way to break the silence in an ugly scene. That's part of it, I think. But also, I think that that's something we wanted to capture in the dialogue. Jimmy did a great job of capturing that in the dialogue. And also he caught it with 2025 language because, we were using different terms 30 years ago. My dad was using different terms 63 years ago. The nature of the banter was the same, but the dialogue was slightly different. I think so
yeah.
it's good that he kind of updated that for us.
Now, this isn't the first collaboration you've done, though. You've been working together on the Cold Case Christianity YouTube channel for a while, isn't that right? So, what sort of content will folks find over there?
Well, I mean, look, we did a bunch of podcasts together, and we're now in a season, and seasons are seasons are really important, I think, in life. So for me, I can see where Jimmy is in his seasons. The season when you're single, that season when you're married but you don't have any kids, that season when you're married with kids, which is a 25-year all hands on deck. You make a living, so you help your kids out, all that stuff. And then there's a season when your kids are gone and you're empty nested. I wrote 10 books in that season. And then there's a season when you have grandchildren. And so Jimmy's right now in that season where he's a new parent, not new, like 2 years into this project. And he's got a brand new baby right now. So he's got 2 kids. And for us, this is that season of grandparenting. So our things change. So right now we are not
This
doing,
is apologetic for why I haven't been contributing anything and been lazy, basically. That's what he's trying to get across here is that you'll see a lot of Jay Warner Wallace and maybe an occasional guest appearance by me.
Yeah, well,
That's
this
what.
is true. We haven't done podcasts together yet, but we also knew that part of the reason why we didn't do these podcasts because I'm so respectful. Like Clay, look how much time it's taken for us to do this. We scheduled it, you and I. We do this. You have to post produce it. It's a video. So I think what will happen in the future for us is we'll probably do these just as audio podcasts because then for a number of seasons, we were doing podcasts, Jimmy and I, that had to be exactly 28 minutes because they were rebroadcast on the
Sure.
NRB network, and that has to be 28 minutes. I love going a lot longer than that. I don't think I want to try to cut it back to 28 minutes, and I don't even want to have to put a time limit on it. And each one could be different. So I think that's the future for Jimmy and I is that at some point we're going to go back to podcasting where we're just going to be doing the audio, not the video. And we're not going to be concerned about, because a lot of it is, hey, before I get in front of a camera, I got to set the camera up. I got to set the lighting up. I got to put a jacket on. You do all these things in preparation for a video segment that you don't need to do for podcast segments. And so I think in this season where we have young kids again, the way to stay active is to kind of less is more. Let's get back to just audio
Yeah.
podcasting. So I think that's probably where we'll be going in the future. But in the meantime, yeah, there's a bunch of videos from Jimmy, a bunch of articles from Jimmy on the website. So it's a collaborative effort at coldcasechristianity.com.
Wonderful. And then over there, and then just in your general apologetics work, Jimmy, do you have something you like specialize in? Is your dad kind of focused in this arena and you like to spend your time and you're teaching in a different one? What does that look like for you?
I just try to keep him from saying anything that's too heretical that'll set the world on fire. So, I just pull him back from the flames there.
You have veto control on what gets published.
Yes, we can finish the conversation. He'll say, "Do not post that. Do not post that."
No. Hey, I'm just happy to be around. I think that my heart is just I want to serve God in whatever capacity I can. So if there's something that I can do to jump in on, I want to do it. Whatever that means. I'd like to think that that there's something that I'm particularly good at that I could say is my specialty, but I'm not a good writer or a good talker. So I don't know exactly where I would point to, but I'm just happy to be in the mix.
That's very very humble. I'm guessing your dad would disagree and sing your praises in all those arenas. But I'm glad that you've had the opportunity to collaborate a number of times here.
Well, let me just say this to you. I think people listen to us and listen to all of us, all three of us on the screen right now, and they'll say, okay, that's a different category of Christian. Like, okay, they're a Christian apologist. I never saw myself as a Christian apologist. I mean, you can ask Jimmy. I mean, I got saved and I thought, well, how do I jump in? This is just like him. Like I wanted to contribute in some way. Well, how do you contribute? Well, at first we contributed in children's ministry because Jimmy was a child. He was in the third grade. He was 8 years old. So we sat in his children's class, and eventually we became teachers in that class. And by the time he was in the fifth grade, we were running the program. Okay, well, we didn't know anything. We were just 1 week ahead of the other fifth graders. That was it. And as long as we could stay 1 week ahead of those kids, we would be okay. And then eventually I went to seminary, and then I was his youth pastor. And then eventually we launched a church, and Jimmy was part of our house church for years. I would say to people who are listening is that you're us, we're you. I don't do this for a living. I was a detective for a living. I still live on my pension. Please, God, let the stock market continue to fund our pension. But the point is, this is just the nature of how we made a living. We are not professional apologists. I don't even know why. Look, if this duty has been given to every Christian, so that that Peter would say that it's not just some of you who have to be ready to give the reason for the hope you have. All of you need to be ready to give the
Yep.
reason for the hope you have. Well, that means that every Christian should be doing something like this, just being able to be articulate and making the case affirmatively and in response to questions for what they believe is true. So if you're watching us, I always think it's funny when people will say, well, what is your area? Like they're saying, what's your area? But I'm just a Christian who got saved really by making a case for it in my own mind so I could know this is true. And now I'm ready to tell other people about it. And I don't think we're anything all that different than anybody else. And now we just bring our niche. We happen to be detectives. So we'll talk about it through a detective's lens. But, Jordan Peterson makes a case for his 12 rules for life through his role as a psychologist. I'm going to make I'll tell you 15 rules for life through my lens as a detective. If you're listening, you probably have 12 rules for life that you developed through your life experience. And trust me, you could make that publicly. You could make that case publicly and have an impact on the church. We're in a content creation generation. There's not really anyone who wants to make a case publicly for Christianity. Right now is the time to do it. It's so easy to get online. It's so easy to use social media to do that. So I just want to encourage people who are listening to realize this is just how you end up expressing your faith in the 21st century.
Yeah.
I'm not a street evangelist, but all we do is talk about Jesus online. So anyone can do this. So I want to encourage you. I remember I was teaching high schoolers when I was with Sean McDowell, when Sean said, you should write a book. And that was 15 years ago. And I thought, nah, I don't have time. But Sean was right. Step out. What if only 1,000 people read your book? That's awesome.
Yeah.
Let's do it. I think that now is the time where we have to stop. We've made a case for why this worldview is true. And a lot of Christians are like, oh, hey, we need to get out there in the culture. Well, let's contribute. If every Christian contributed something, we'd see a tidal wave. And that's why I think it's important for our story. It's not really a special story. It's just our story. You have a story too. Let's leverage it for the kingdom.
Yeah. And there's a lot of believers that no doubt are passionate about their faith, maybe feel a little ill prepared for doing things like this. You've got a lot of books that can help. You've got a lot of videos that can help. And now you've got a graphic novel that can help that as well and help them feel a little bit more prepared to make that case and to make that defense. What's next? Do you already have any follow-on plans? Do you have a sequel in mind for this graphic novel? What does that look like for you both?
Well, Jimmy's working on that, so I'll let him talk about it.
We are working on it. We actually probably should be doing that today, passing notes back and forth. But there is a sequel in the works. Hopefully it will be done sooner rather than later. We're doing some last minute tweaks because we end up with a little bit more of extra time. And so we will see a lot of the characters today. If you enjoyed volume 1, a lot of the same characters are going to reappear. We're going to try to tackle a different question that's related to an apologetic issue. So the next round, we'll be talking about the moral argument, what makes something right or wrong. And similarly, what makes somebody a good guy or a bad guy. That's something we see or I see at least in law enforcement. It's easy for the cops to start thinking they're the good guys and the people they arrest are the bad guys. But where does the line really fall, and who really decides that? Who's right and who's wrong in those issues. So I think we're going to try to touch on the moral argument, the existence of moral laws, and what does that say about the existence of God in volume 2.
Wonderful. Wonderful. This has been a really enjoyable conversation. Where can folks go to learn more about your apologetics work and also to pick up a copy of Case Files, Murder and Meaning?
Well, you'll see it in the book section and on the head banner at our website, coldcasechristianity.com. That's always a good place to kind of find anything we're doing, coldcasechristianity.com. And we do have a really, I think, a pretty decent offer that we're giving to people who purchase and review the book. And here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, this is a gateway book, but if you're going to give it to somebody, how are you going to engage them in conversation about these issues? So we've got a conversation guide that comes with the book. We've got a free digital copy of our Case Closed, a case for the resurrection. So it's a small booklet that'll help you make that case. We've actually got Jimmy's a directory for Christian comic books, because people always ask, well, where else can I find a good Christian comic book or graphic novel? Jimmy has a pretty thorough list for that. That'll help you. Also, we have our 30-session Case Makers course, 10 and a half hours of content with an entire written curriculum that goes with it that we offer for free to anyone who purchases the book. What we're trying to do is say, yeah, look, this is a work of fiction. If you're going to use it as an evangelistic tool, you're going to need to be a better evangelist, a better case maker. Well, how can we help you do that? And how can we help you do that for free? Well, that's what we're trying to do at that website, right? I always tell people, exhaust everything an author will offer for free before you end up buying their book. And so if I'm going to charge a book, if I'm going to sell a book, even though this book right now is pretty reasonable on Amazon, I want you to get a bunch of stuff for free so that you don't feel like that was an expensive ask. So that's what we try to do on our website. You'll see that offer there at coldcasechristianity.com.
Excellent. Well, I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes for this episode. I'll also link to our previous conversations. I think this makes number 5. So I think technically you're the co-host of this podcast at this point. But I'll link to that in the show notes. You'll find that at reasonabletheology.org/casefiles. Just both of you, tremendous thank you. Really appreciate the conversation. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having us. I appreciate you.
Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel and, more importantly, sharing this video with a friend who you think would get something out of it. You can find additional resources at reasonabletheology.org.